An unusual practice implemented by Genshin Impact that, at least based on my history playing gachas, is a questionable decision is how veteran 5-star characters are not reinstated into permanent circulation after their maiden voyage. When looking at most other gacha titles, traditionally once the future unit's banner runs its course, either they get put straight into the available pool where you can theoretically obtain them year-round, or the developers wait until their rerun banner anywhere between 6 to 12 months to do so, with the exception of limited time ones, collaborations, or holiday-themed things of that nature. You can imagine my surprise when I found out that Genshin, and I suppose by extension most other mainstream gacha titles like HSR, WUA, and ZZZ, don't follow that formula. Even dating back to the very first ever feature 5-star Venti, not a single character has been added to the standard banner that wasn't already intended to be brought there in the first place, which I mentioned in my video on too many characters where it's becoming progressively more unsustainable given the 2 banner capacity per cycle. As of today, only 3 new 5-star units were brought into permanent circulation, bringing the total pool of 5 stars to 8. Koching, Diluc, Qiqi, Mona, Jin, Tighnari, Dehya, and Mizuki. Having made a wide-known place on 4 out of the original 5 and even making one on Dehya when she first came out, there's an obvious pattern among the Genshin 5-star units in that they're not exactly favorites throughout the fandom, nor do they really have the highest meta relevance in this day and age. In light of that, I wanted to make a Why No One Plays episode on the 8 of them collectively, with the focus on the 3 new ones, and talk about why they're such a caliber below the majority of the limited 5 stars. What I find most interesting about the standard banner 5 stars is that they serve as an excellent point of reference on how the progression of power creep has been affecting the game. As one of the more power creep resistant gacha titles, Genshin has been able to maintain the relevance of a wide number of version 1 and 2 units despite us now about to enter version 6. Throughout that time, members like Jin, Koching, Diluc, and such have had moments where their standing in the metagame improved a fair bit following the advent of a new character or mechanic that they could synergize with. That being said, even in spite of their second win, the standard 5 stars at large have been losing presence at a considerable pace. While Diluc may have found a return to form with the release of Arena and Xianyun, Arlecchino and Mavuika's arrivals have all but pushed him back down again by measure of opportunity cost. The same applies to Koching. She was elevated to a fairly strong position by way of Aggravate playing exactly to her 1000 cuts win condition, but she too would get overshadowed by Clorent, and then later the trio of Nanlan Electra units moving the goalpost once more. Barring Qiqi, the poor thing, the other 4 5 stars in the initial pool essentially got buffed in one way or another, giving them a chance to be viable in the metagame again, if only for a short time, and while they're still more than serviceable for most of the game's content, our selection of available means to handle that content has expanded beyond what they could remotely account for, even with that little boost. It's very much a case of those indirect buffs being force multipliers, but when someone comes around with a higher baseline than them, there's only so much amplifying a supposed mediocre character can achieve. In their defense, the original 5 stars were conceptualized and balanced around just the framework of version 1.0. You can't blame them for failing to stand the test of time. By that logic though, one would assume when Hoyo eventually adds new members to the permanent roster, that they would be balanced around the time they came out to alleviate that. Yes, but also no. In the case of Tighnari, people were very optimistic about the future of standard 5 stars after seeing what he had to offer. Riding off the wind of Dendro's novelty and strength, Tighnari established himself as a solid DPS character for quicken teams, namely in single target fashion, though eventually he was superseded by Alhaitham, who practically outperformed him even in his own niche. For a standard banner 5 star, Tighnari was a cut above his predecessors in strength and quality. With the advantage of being permanent, players could eventually, with an insane amount of luck, acquire further copies of him, making his constellations go from something that only the whales had access to something one could reasonably factor into him when deciding who to play. Although to be fair, with the exception of C6, all of Tighnari's constellations offer noticeably less impact than that of a limited time unit. His position in the metagame remained fairly stable all throughout versions 3 and 4, and objectively speaking, there's nothing egregiously wrong with the guy for what he has to offer. If you're trying to dip your feet into Dendro, you could do much worse than him. I think I speak for most people when I say he's one of the better units to lose your 50-50 on. So what happened to him? Nothing really, save for everyone else getting stronger. But that's ultimately what happened. Tighnari is a DPS character, but most of his appeal is derived from Dendro's high base power supplementing his own damage, making his strength a bit deceptive in that it wasn't him that carried the strength, rather he and the elements splitting it. Being one of the last members of the 2nd generation, he would get eclipsed by the very soon arrival of the 3rd generation, and though technically there hasn't been any new Dendro attackers up until the eventual release of Kinetion 5.0, the other elements all got stronger, making him fall off in relativity as he never was one of the best Dendro units to begin with. When even Nahida and Alhaitham haven't been getting the same numbers in the current landscape that they once had, expectedly a B-list unit like Tighnari, whose equity was already tenuous to begin with, would be the first to go. Keep in mind, Tighnari is considered to be the strongest of the 8 intrinsically speaking. I'm sure you can infer that the other 2 haven't been doing nearly as well. Later in version 3 came Dehya, one of the more prominent characters in the Sumeru Archon questline, having one of the most badass designs to boot and a visually appealing elemental burst, literally throwing her sword away and choosing to throw hands instead. Expectations ran very high for Dehya given the fact that around that time Pyro went from being one of the best elements in the game to one of the worst. Everyone thought that she would be the successor to Hu Tao, someone who could dish out tons of Pyro damage but with hopefully a more modernized baseline, which only made it all the more soul-crushing to find out instead of taking a step forward from Hu Tao, they f***ing went backwards instead. Dehya was so weak when she first came out that she was even worse than Diluc, or even a number of 4 stars. To this day, she is one of the worst designed kits in the game, almost as if there were 2 different developers working on her. One half of her kit is aimed at soaking up damage for her team like a cover tank and applying off-field pyro damage at the same time, while the other half is supposed to be DPS oriented. The problem is that not only did she fail on both sides, but they were mutually exclusive from one another. If you wanted to play towards one win condition, you had to forego the other and vice versa, which is one of the biggest missed opportunities in Genshin history to not intermingle the two of them. For the uninitiated, Dehya's skill has her absorb damage taken by her team and store it up to a cap. What does she do with that stored damage? Absolutely nothing, it's just there to put a ceiling on how much you can tank with their skill. As for her ultimate, it's a flurry of intense blows in quick succession of one another. Thing is, they don't count as normal attacks, preventing her from capitalizing on follow-ups like Yelan and Xingqiu's bursts. Couple that with her numbers being abysmal across the board, and the community was almost tempted to call her even worse than Chi-Chi with how unusable she was. Ironically, her constellations are quite good for a standard unit, finding ways to boost her DPS a fair bit, but given that only half of her kit is geared towards DPS, and her baseline being so poor to begin with, if I'm not mistaken, even a C6 Dehya loses to a C0 Hu Tao in Lini or C6 Gaming. Public opinion towards Dehya sort of received an improvement thanks to mild Zeniju and Neuvillette and a few applications in reverse melt, but without question she was one of the most disappointing characters in the game relative to how much people hyped her up. The one advantage to her was that Xiangling aside, consistent off-field pyro damage was in short supply, so maybe you could have found a reason to use her in some niche application, but at this point it would be no exaggeration to say, there is no reason to use her whatsoever, nor will there ever be unless Oil finally decides to fix her functionally unplayable kit. So on one hand, we had a pretty good standard 5-star come out in the form of Tighnari, and then we had one that was by all accounts an abject failure of a character period, let alone a 5-star. With only 2 units to look at, it was difficult to form a conclusion on where Hoyo wants the standard banner units to be in the metagame. We needed a minimum of 3 more to better gauge where things are. Inconveniently, however, whether it's because of the backlash towards Dehya or if Hoyo intended to right from the get-go, we will not receive another standard 5-star for almost 2 years. During this time, the roster began to power creep at an accelerated rate to where by the time the third one came out, even Tighnari was beginning to lose traction. Enter Yume Mizuki, an animo character. A most unusual one in terms of appearance, but interestingly not a member of the version region, instead hailing from Inazuma. Well, technically she took a trip to Natlan on sabbatical, so I guess we can say it's Natlan inspired, but I digress. What does she do? The long and short of it is, she's an animo attacker with a focus on swirl DPS, being the first main attacker who specializes in that reaction. Sounds like a novel concept, doesn't it? Historically, swirl was seen as a supportive reaction with little capacity for being used offensively outside of EV shredding and AoE. We were exploring new territory here, and if done well it could bring more attention to this standard banner. As a convenience, Mizuki brought her own sustain to the table as well. The positives ended there though. There's a reason we haven't had an animo DPS who focused on swirl, and that's because swirl doesn't really do damage. It scales off elemental mastery like the other transformative reactions, but the scaling and frequency of application for swirl leaves a lot to be desired, being one of, if not now, the weakest damaging elemental reaction in the game, and for a good reason. Oftentimes you're supposed to pair swirl with a different reaction, the most popular one being taser so you can spread everything. Problem is, being unable to normal attack while activating her skill prevents you from capitalizing on many of the best taser party members like Xingqiu and Yelan, sort of defeating the purpose of being a swirl boosting attacker. From a DPS point of view, Mizuki scales rather poorly. Her base damage on her skill and burst are quite low, and even if you stack a ton of elemental mastery, again swirl's a very weak offensive reaction. Through constellations, you can get some pretty noteworthy buffs, C2 and 6 in particular having a lot of potential, but her buffing capability isn't really much to write home about. Sucrose cannot perform her in that department. Mizuki does consolidate healing, which can have you believe she can generate fanfare stacks, but there are 2 issues to that as well. First and foremost, it's just not good enough. Unless you have C2 Farina, Mizuki's healing alone falls short, preventing you from capping out fanfare quickly enough for it to be efficient. Secondly, Farina is a personal DPS booster, Mizuki's a reaction DPS booster. The two aren't mutually exclusive, but we just established her base damage is quite poor. There's one more thing, Mizuki's a main attacker. In order to make full use of her, you have to relinquish your DPS slot, and she comes nowhere close to matching the game's current top performers even at max constellation. Across the 3 new members, 2 of them were practically dead on arrival while 1 of them was serviceable for all but maybe 3/4 of a year. Plainly speaking, it's not a very good look for the standard banner. For what it's worth, any 5-star being added is of course better than none at all, but the problem with the standard banner units is how they've always been perceived as a caliber below everything else, even though they realistically don't and shouldn't have to be. In many other gachas, losing the 50/50 is nowhere near as soul-crushing compared to Genshin, HSR, and whatnot, since 1. 5-stars in general offer a universal benefit to the player for simply having them, and or 2, the permanent pool contains units that came out just recently in addition to the old ones. For example, back when I played Final Fantasy Brave Exvius, every character in the game had what is called a Trust Master reward, and for the higher rarities, a Super Trust Master reward. These are equipment you could obtain upon maxing out their TMR or STMR to 100%, either via items or by using them in battle long enough. Acquiring additional copies of a character was therefore not only beneficial, but even paramount for taking on endgame content. People were chasing after dupes of old characters while going after new ones because at the very least you'd be able to get something out of them. Genshin has no such mechanic. Acquiring a copy of Jean or Chi-Chi or Mizuki is of little benefit to the player unless they're actively trying to use them. As well, compared to other titles, Genshin has no dupes. Subsequent copies of a character become constellations, which ties back to the overall point that unless you're using the 5-star, you get nothing out of more copies of them. This applies in tandem to the fact that Genshin's standard 5-stars are all mediocre at best and, relatively speaking, unusable at worst. I don't think I'm alone in saying I wouldn't be as upset about losing a 50/50 if I pulled the constellation for other version 1 or 2 units. Say I'm trying to pull for Columbina or Varka or Alice and lose a 50/50, but I get a Kazuha or Shogun or Hutal. Obviously it sucks to not get the unit I was originally after, but as a consolation I can power up one of the good characters I have, which if you think about it, can also be great for preserving the value of existing characters. When a unit falls off quote unquote, it's mostly in relevance to C0, C1, or in rare cases C2. But when you start entering C3 or higher, even old units can get a sizable boost in power. C6 Tighnari, for example, is like going from base to Super Saiyan. There's a tremendous leap in power between C0 to C6, understandably so, seeing as you need to spend upwards of $1,000 to get them. Therein lies the issue. Turning characters into standard units makes the possibility of getting high constellations on them just that, a possibility. If a player knows they can eventually progress their veteran units over time, that inherently diminishes their urgency to pull for them. In other words, far less people will pull for a 5-star rerun if they're already in circulation all year round, which is why Hoyo doesn't want to add units to the permanent pool. Conversely, those who are added to the permanent pool are made intentionally mediocre so as not to undermine the significance of pulling for the limited characters. Even their constellations are not as much of a difference maker as a feature 5-star. Say for instance back in version 2 they decided to make Raiden Shogun permanent, and through sheer RNG you managed to pull 6 copies of her by losing X amount of 50/50s. At C6, Shogun's a beast, easily destroying the likes of C0 Clarent and Varesa. That's gonna be one less person who's easily convinced to pull for those 2 units, which means less potential revenue to be made. In totality, no one plays the standard banner units because if they're strong, that lowers the pressure to pull for new characters. Mizuki and Dehya being underwhelming was completely intentional for the purposes of maintaining that separation of the classes between the permanent and the limited. It doesn't apply to 4-stars because even at C6, a 4-star won't shake up the meta too much, but a C6 5-star, especially if they were a limited character that turns standard, most definitely will. I do hope in the future Hoyo acquiesces a little though. In my opinion, plenty of older 5-stars can safely be made standard without affecting the popularity of new characters. There has to be a win-win solution, where by making some of the limited units permanent, they could alleviate the overcrowding problem and even allow those units to see relevance in the metagame since again, 5-star constellations can make a world of difference. But what do you guys think about permanent 5-stars? Do you agree or disagree with my points? You're welcome to share in the comments down below. For now though, if you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe would be much appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter @Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other discussion videos if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.
Preparing for dust up. Installation check.